one of the things that I think is important to say in the beginning is that there is a division between those who work with systemic historical violence and then those who work with unsustainability. And my research collective is trying to put the two together and say we need to address them both together, because if we can't learn from what has happened in terms of systemic violence, we can't really understand where collapse comes from and how our the systems that provides us with comforts, with securities and enjoyments, how they have been built on the broken backs of other people and of the earth itself. So this is a connection that very few groups are doing, but that is very important. I've just come back from a gathering looking at ideas of what they would frame as the house of modernity falling. We, in this group, it's a network of about 10 indigenous communities that have a framework called Cinco Curas, which is translates loosely as 5 cycles of healing. We actually started from the concept of justice, 5 concepts of justice: cognitive justice, affective justice, relational justice, as a precondition for ecological and economic justice to come. And the members of the community really said justice is not a concept that reflects what's needed. And partly it was because they were using a framework where you have individualism and collectivism, which are frameworks that are acceptable within modernity. But for them, it is metabolism. We are all part of this metabolic organism that we have forgotten about because we think of ourselves as separate. And the metabolism is sick, and we need to, and because the metabolism is sick, we're sick as well, and we need to heal. And healing our thinking, our sentience, our feeling, our relationships, our exchanges, and our cycles is a precondition for us to exist differently. So one of the things they say, for example, is that when non-Indigenous people come and ask them what their proposal is, they are expecting a form of doing or a form of thinking. And when they come up with the response that it is actually healing and it's a new form of existing, not just doing or thinking, people generally don't understand what that means. And when we actually adapted one of the deep adaptation exercises that we did in the retreat for the community. So we did the collapse exercise, but translated into a language that people would understand, related to, okay, in one station you lose access to supermarkets, gas stations, and banks. The other station you lose access to, it was a walk that they had to do. You lose access to the grid, the energy grid, water, tap water, and treated sewage. And as we were doing it, many said, well, this is not collapse for us because this is our daily reality. And some people actually felt quite offended that we were talking about it as collapse, because they can survive in that environment. And they found ways of not just surviving, but establishing community and establishing practices that are extremely valuable for us as well in those environments. And the last station that we had was the mental health collapse, where we start killing each other. And no matter what we did to prepare, it's going to be raided and there's going to be a lot of violence. And what they said was that if relationships are not healed and not grounded, that's exactly what's going to happen. So there's no point preparing if we're not healing the ways that we are feeling or our sentience, and accessing what we call in the project exiled capacities. And they access these exiled capacities through ceremonies and through entheogenic practices, or through dances and festivals and other kinds of rituals. So if we don't have a different neurobiology to work with the metabolism from a position of visceral responsibility, we will end up trying to protect what we've got or protect our families from violence erupting from diseased relationships. So I think that's one example of a framework that gestures towards deep adaptation, but from a very, very different ontometaphysics, I would say.
Wow. So you've gone right to the heart of the matter there. I don't know if my Zoom collapsed on me. I had to restart. So I missed out a little bit about which community you were talking about, where you've been having these conversations and gaining this insight and advice.
It's a network called Teia das Cinco Curas. So most of the materials are only in Portuguese. I can send it if necessary, but it's 10 indigenous communities that emerged out of a different network looking at the 5 justices framework, but they were all already, they all had an understanding that the house of modernity was going to fall, and that the house of modernity was going to fall on them first, because this house was built on their back.
For those who don't know what modernity means in your framework, could you just say what it means for you, or what it means to them when they use it? Because it's kind of like shorthand for a whole range of things, isn't it?
Oh, yes. The shorthand of the shorthand is that is the way they refer to it in the project between themselves, is white people's house basically is going to collapse. So the settlers' house is going to collapse because it's unsustainable, and it has always been, and its maintenance is predicated on continuous violence. So the fact that it is falling, the framework we use is that this house is based on a foundation of separability. There's nation states and artificial borders being imposed on one carrying wall. The other carrying wall is universal reason, one form of rationality, and single story of progress, development, and human evolution also being imposed. In the current roof is the roof of shareholder financial capitalism, which then is structurally damaged in terms of maintaining the house, because it depends on exponential growth and consumption to be maintained. And in the house there, so this house is depends on extraction and expropriation to be built, and it's exceeding the limits of the planet. But at the same time, we have to pay attention to the dynamics within the house. There's stairs in the house of social mobility, for example, that is then perceived as the purpose of life, and there are promises of a global middle class for all, which do not consider the limits of the planet. So there are lots of crises right now in the house, and the sewage, what we say there, that the sewage pipes are blocked and the shit is coming up. So people in the house have already put all the waste back into the planet. People who are not in the house are either wanting to come in or have lost their capacity to survive outside.
So this is a massive, holistic, deep, challenging critique of where so many people are coming from, the worldview, so many real deep assumptions about themselves and about progress in society that perhaps people hadn't even realized. And so a lot of people are coming to a concern about climate change, particularly in the West now, where it's quite new for them. And then, so even to question capitalism is quite radical, but you're going way deeper than that to actually say that the very way we just carry about our lives and think about ourselves and the way that we will, you talk about neurobiological, the way that we're wired, the way that we respond to a perception of threat, all that, there's an invitation from the critiques that you've shared, but also from the wisdom from the people you're talking to. There's an invitation to just a total transformation of how we are in the world. And you even mentioned entheogenic substances, but also spiritual dance and all sorts of things. So how does it work for you when you're at a Western university in Canada, when you're talking to people maybe who are a bit worried about what climate change means with local forest fires or food prices going up. And then you're bringing this massive global critique and invitation to connect with and learn from indigenous peoples in Peru and everywhere.
In Brazil,
How,
yeah.
how is that working out for you?
I think the timing is right to do these things, I guess. For example, with the fires in the Amazon, the university was very quick to actually ask and support somebody coming from this network who is in Acre, who is suffering the effects of the fires, to come to the university and talk. On the other hand, there's also a lot of interest in psychedelic research at the moment. So when Poland came to my university, it was booked up. Like there were no seats left in 5 minutes when they started selling the tickets, and they sold the tickets. So there is a kind of a momentum in a window where talking about these things is not perceived to be esoteric, I think. And people are, and I think partly it is because of a global mental health crisis too. People are looking for ways of addressing the anxiety and the depression of having to deal with imminent end of the world as we know it, right? Which is not the end of the world, period. It's just the end of something.
So I've seen very strange, unusual data like YouGov poll that said that the majority of people in 24 out of 28 countries think that climate change will hurt themselves in their own lives and will trigger wars. I mean, this is if this kind of research is backed up by other opinion polls, then we are seeing a real, as you say, this and global anxiety, and therefore, yes, a mental health issue. And so you find that people are asking they're ready for deep critical questions. That could go in a number of ways though, couldn't it, Vanessa? I mean, it could be that people turn away from global solidarity and curiosity about the other, the so-called other, and turn inward and just want to protect them and theirs. How do you invite people that are feeling fear about the future, as many people in deep adaptation conversation do? How do you invite them into this curious and to have this appetite for actually letting go of everything that we thought we knew and welcoming a whole different way of being in the world?
I think first of all, I think one thing that you mentioned too before that has been our concern is the hijacking of this agenda by the right and the far right, specifically, that then manipulates fear and gets people to be polarized. And this is already happening in Brazil and in many other places. So, and this divides communities and divides families in very cruel ways. And this is something we're keeping on the table to see. But what they say there is that like the polarization exacerbates the same way of being. It takes it to its limits, because people, it's the unconscious of people coming up. And I think we are realizing that the Cartesian person really only exists in a certain context. Once we are afraid of losing things, it's unconscious fears and insecurities that come up. And the response to that from these communities is not a response of segregation and isolation. They invite people in, and they invite people into processes of cleansing and healing out of necessity, because they know that if we allow this exacerbation to reach a limit, it will become extremely dangerous for all of us, right? So there is an urgency there, but there are two issues. There's one issue of translation of what they are offering and how people perceive them. That is an educational issue that we're working on. And there's also an issue of consumption. So a lot of people want these things, but are coming with a consumptive attitude. That, and I'm not just talking about consumption of stuff, of objects, but I'm talking about the consumption of knowledge, relationships, of experiences, as a mode of existing in the world that we learn inside that house. And once you approach this, even the entheogenics, in that way, it doesn't have the same effect. The invitation of the community for the entheogenics, for example, is that you cleanse yourself so that you can be of use to the metabolism for others. You don't do that to increase your creativity or functionality within the capitalist system.
Where metabolism is used as the word for the planet Earth, or of the life force, or something more local?
It is used as the planet and beyond. So depending on the context, we use land. So land is not just the soil, land is the body, land is the animals, land is the trees, land is the forest, and land is what has been and what will be. So we shifted it to metabolism, because when people think about land, they still think about property or resource, and metabolism is alive. So the idea that this metabolism is biointelligent, that we are part of it, and that it can speak through us once we are decluttered from all these other things we are using to cope with the traumas that are, some of them are collective and historical, some of them are individual. And they have techniques and practices, not knowledge systems, but practices that can help us declutter. So we talk about decenter, disarm, declutter, and discern.
So Vanessa, I'm realizing that, so I'm involved in this deep adaptation forum, which didn't exist 7 months ago, and now it's grown. We have about 10,000 people engaged in our various different platforms. And the question has come up about whether why is it that we are fairly middle-class Western? I don't want to erase the diversity that's already in this network, but still, we are still quite Western. And so I was wondering, what do we do about that? And then there's almost like two questions already, because I'm wondering if one is, if we turn our attention to the wisdoms and the deep critiques that you're connected to and you're offering. I do remember how there's sort of a niche in the West that's existed for ages, which is middle-class people who are like in touch with indigenous people's wisdoms. And that actually is seen, therefore, as taking them away from connection and solidarity and being real with working class communities in their own countries. So there's almost like these two different things to respond to. One is getting real and getting engaged in the working classes in where you're based, but also the other is this much more deeper critique about the whole of modernity that you're offering. Is there a cross-cutting sort of bit of guidance you could give? Is it because I was wondering, is it that just simply that people like me need to pay more attention to all the currently underprivileged in terms of the ability to communicate, to be heard, to influence all the different groups and peoples and so on? Or is there any advice you could give as we are going to go into a strategic review and decide what we on earth should we be doing in 2020?
It is very complex, as you said, and complicated, because there are several layers of issues and problems that we haven't been able yet to sit with. So, for example, the issue of inclusion is one that is difficult, because generally, even with my body inside the university, the idea is that you include a diverse body, but business goes on as usual, right? So you're there at the service of other people. And generally for white middle class learning, you are instrumentalized for that learning. And if you refuse to do that, you're punished, right? So people usually think about racism as like, I don't like white people, but actually in an institution, and I think it would be the same for the deep adaptation movement, it's the perception that you're coming in through the back door, you are here to serve, and if you make a mistake, you don't have the benefit of the doubt, you're punished straight away. Or if you refuse to do what you're supposed to do, you're punished straight away. So there's that problem there, that it can't be this relationship, it can't be this transaction. And people who are not used to seeing how the dominant system is violent need to learn how even the expectations that they put on inclusion are violent on the body of those who are included. On the other hand, there are also layers of the struggle of people of color and of Black people and Indigenous people. There's a political layer where people have to operate within the discourses that are given to them in a specific struggle that were not of their making. And then there is another layer, which is existential, which is the layer that these communities that I'm working with are working on, right? So the communities I'm working on are of people who have been through the political struggle and given up, basically saying, this is not gonna go anywhere. We need to go back to the trunk of this. And it is a question of existence. It's not a question of politics for them. But there are other people in their communities who continue the political struggle and who will continue to draw the lines that need to be drawn to protect the territories, to protect the people from racism, or genocide, right? To now with Bolsonaro wanting to invade the indigenous lands, to go and stay in solidarity with NGOs and lawyers to try to push back on what the government wants to do. So there are lots of things that need to be done, I think, and lots of complexities we need to sit with. But I think for people who have not thought about these issues before, we have in that booklet that you show, there are 3 denials there. We have included another one. So there's the denial of systemic violence. It is a denial, we're using denial in terms of a sanctioned ignorance. We need to do our homework in relation to that, understand how we got to the place that we got now, not just wanting to jump into a solution or a preparation for the collapse, but we need to understand why we are getting to collapse right now. The second one is unsustainability. Why is it that we denied the limits of the planet? And how it is that the governments are still denying it, right? Then the third one is the denial of entanglement, the denial of the metabolism itself. How on earth did we come to see ourselves as separate from this, as separate from each other, as separate from the other animals, as separate from the earth? And the fourth denial that we included is the denial of the magnitude of the problem. So the idea that we need quick fixes, easy solutions, or that we need to look good, feel good, and do good and move forward. This is all getting on the way of us really growing up and saying, okay, we need to step up here.
That last point. I mean, I'm involved in a lot of conversations with people about how do we affect change on climate at scale. And yeah, there is this assumption that we're not somehow complicit, and we're not somehow, you know, involved in all the bad stuff, and also a yearning to find a simple story of feeling still okay about oneself, and that means feeling that one is right and that one is agentic, and there's that. I mean, it's okay to have that going on, but maybe not to be unconscious that that's what's happening when we're looking at what to do. I just want to say that everyone on this, I've got a few questions that people have sent to Matthew, only 3, but please now then you can in the next few minutes put your questions in the chat box or send them to Matthew, and then I will call you in a moment. Vanessa, I just wanted to ask you before we move over to everyone else. The field of climate justice has been around for a while, and I remember 10 years ago, this emphasis was about contraction and convergence, so how the West has caused the problem more than everywhere else, and therefore we should cut carbon more and we should fund other countries to do so. And then now, but of course, deep adaptation is in a different realm, which is saying, well, this is already damaging societies and it's going to get far worse. So that I was wondering, how does your analysis about decolonizing the conversation, and what's going on here, how does that relate to the justice question, and what does climate justice look like on adaptation? And who should decide? You know, is it basically we should be listening? Who should we be listening to tell us what is fair, what is just on the adaptation agenda?
I think the journey starts with the systemic, historical, and ongoing violence, addressing that denial, basically that foreclosure. Because if we don't understand how violence operates, even the concept of justice becomes extremely superficial. I still use justice in the academic work because it makes more sense to talk about that in the West than talking about healing. Healing can very quickly become very new age, and in a not a very good way, because then it's all about the self again and the innocence of the self, which is something we're trying to move away from. That's why we talk a lot about shit. So we say there's individual shit we need to compost, there's collective shit we need to compost, and we need to figure out how to compost individual shit so that we can show up differently to compost the affective, cognitive, and relational shit we have to compost that creates the economic and ecological problems that we're facing, right? So justice then starts, I think, from a position of wanting to show up differently for a very, very messy issue, and having the stamina to do that. Now, if justice is a teleological process from A to B, right? So, okay, I'll do that, and it's going to be a checklist, and lots of people ask for checklists. A checklist so that I can feel good about myself again, right? So that I don't feel complicit. This is actually part of the problem, right? So we are all if we're all in the same metabolism, we are all complicit with the metabolism being sick, we're all sick. And therefore, we need to start from a grown-up position, not an infantilized position, because the house actually itself infantilizes us to be able to want to stay in the playground, right? To feel good, to look good, to do good, and to move forward. What about, instead of moving forward, digging deeper and taking responsibility, so that, and viscerally, not just for our species, but for all species, so that if there is a chance this can be interrupted, we will do what is needed rather than what we want to do. So there's one last, I think, analogy that we use here in Peru. It might look banal, but it actually helps pedagogically. So we were waiting to cross a very busy road here, very close to here actually. And there was a group of 10 of us, and we were waiting for the traffic to stop a little bit, but this very little dog decided to cross the street. And it was really interesting to observe the response of people in the group who already have the critique and all of that. We were working together. So some people just closed their eyes, others closed their ears, others closed their mouth. Some people froze, other people just had this different reaction that they couldn't move, but they had a jolt, right? And one person went to the middle of the road and stopped traffic. And the person who did it didn't calculate whether or not she was going to get hurt or what was going to happen. She just stopped traffic. The dog passed, and she went after the dog and didn't even realize she had done it. So we will need more people who can stop traffic, even if it goes against their self-interest. My interest is in what kind of education and what kind of unlearning process do we need to be able to declutter to that level